Epitaph and Elegy, written by J.M. Turner. Narrated by Aaron Miller. The sky was leaden and oppressive, as it had been yesterday and the day before, an infinite stretch of gray eager to unburden itself. The blackened ruins of towers and parapets looming like reapers in the distance were all that broke up the horizon. There was a strange sort of beauty in the desolation of cloud, stone, and ash. "Gods above," growled Povel, brushing back rogue strands of his red hair. "The sky and land all run together. It's like looking into an abyss, a gray abyss." While Povel's complaints normally chafed at her patience, Sylvia now found them a welcome distraction from the grave they were approaching. "I rather like it. Keeps the sun from my eyes." "It does do that, I suppose." "How many more miles do you think we have between us and the city?" Povel shrugged his lank shoulders. "Who's to say? The horses will need to be rested and watered before long. If we keep a good pace, we may make it before dusk." "Very well. I am in no hurry." Balathon," Sylvia thought with a sort of grim reverence. Though she had spent months poring over what fragmented information the guild had regarding the shrouded city, Sylvia was unsure what she should expect to find. Would it be rubble, a glorified pile of stones, or perhaps much like a prepared corpse presented during a wake, dead but still clinging to a semblance of life? She pondered this for the rest of the day's journey, lost in thought until she passed beneath the shadow of a lone, slouched caryatid. Sylvia raised her head and beheld the city as it sat in silence, a crumbling monument to the lost. Balathon was known to the common folk by the names City of Ash, the Nameless Place, or the Light that was Snuffed. To most learned folk, however, it was referred to as either the Tomb of the Scholars or the Cairn of Knowledge. Countless odd and wonderful artifacts and texts from the city rested in museums and laboratories across the lands, awaiting for their secrets to be revealed. Artificers and academics alike spent entire careers struggling in vain to discern the form and function of these mysterious objects. Though every researcher asked different questions of the relics, there was one inquiry that burned bright in the collective minds. What calamity brought this mighty city, this beating heart of progress, to absolute destruction? "And why do so few visitors come back?" Sylvia asked herself. It was a well-known and accepted fact that the disappearance rate among those exploring Balathon was well above the average, and those that did come back were never quite the same. To discern the cause of this phenomenon was the reason Povel and Sylvia gave the guild when asking for funding and approval for their expedition. In truth, both scholars had deeper motives for venturing into the deadly unknown, but they had kept those secrets between themselves. Their horses sensed the death surrounding them and began to stamp their hooves restlessly. Sylvia took special notice of this behavior, as the mounts had proven themselves gentle and steadfast beasts on numerous occasions during the journey through the Deadlands, and their nervousness would not be without reason. "The horses are spooked," she said, looking to Povel for a response. "A common reaction upon entering the city. They will settle soon enough." "We should keep to the main thoroughfare," said Sylvia, the disquiet from the horses beginning to crawl up into her. "Try to stay out of the shadows. And if you feel an ache in your head coming on, for the love of the lady, turn back. There, yes, the stones found within the autopsied skulls, the human teeth marks on the bones, all the grotesque horror," said Povel with a smile. I know, Sylvia. I've read the accounts, same as you.
Cannibalism,
Sylvia shuddered.
What kind of sickness would make one do such a thing?
Madness, or something very like it.
Do you think this madness overcame Alexander?
That is what I intend to discover. Sylvia was silent for a spell, weighing whether to revisit an old argument.
I know I have said it many times before, but I must say it just this last time. You do not have to be here on my account, Povel. The risks here are great, and I would be beside myself with guilt and sorrow if—
I'm aware of the dangers. Povel's interruption was quick and sharp. And you're well aware that I'm here for more reasons than your fool's errand. So, for the last time, rid your mind of this worry.
Fool's errand,
Sylvia thought, as a surge of indignation began to well up within her. She almost bit back with a snide retort, but seeing the futility of such a peevish behavior in a location as treacherous as Umbalathon, she thought better of it. Forgive me, said Povel in a voice more somber. I spoke in haste. Your quest is admirable, Sylvia, and I'm happy to help. Please, let us just focus on our surroundings. The consequences of a misstep could be dire.
Thank you, Povel,
Sylvia replied, her anger dissipating.
The road has shortened our tempers.
No doubt. Povel and Sylvia urged their horses forward through the shattered gatehouse and onto the marred cobblestone streets. The air instantly felt different, thinner, and Sylvia sensed her breaths were less satisfying. She recalled years prior when she stood on the rocky peak of Mount Monastery, gazing down at the fields and hills far below. Her head had spun, and not only from the grandeur of the view, but from the struggling of her lungs to catch a proper breath. She felt a similar sensation now, though where thrill had been in the past, trepidation now took hold. I feel it too, said Povel, noting Sylvia's pallor. Sylvia pulled the hood of her cloak over her dark hair while she cast a wary eye on the tumbling stone structures. There had been no reports of any sort of living thing in Umbalathon, but she could not shake the sense of being watched. She tried imagining the city during its golden age of prosperity. Instead of collapsing masonry and ash-choked fountains, Sylvia saw proud, whitewashed edifices and verdant, ivy-crawling walls and walkways. The colossal spire she could see reaching toward the sky from deeper within the bowels of Umbalathon was no longer battered and bruised, but glowing in splendid sunlight with 100 banners snapping in the warm breeze. That must be the library, said Povel as he raised a finger toward the towering feat of architecture. That's our goal. Sylvia's mouth formed into a tight line.
Could we make it in the dark?
I am hesitant to travel these streets at night. Let's keep an eye out for a suitable campsite. They pressed onward for almost an hour more, passing countless piles of rubble and ruin, all indistinguishable from one another. It wasn't until they reached the barren grounds of a decrepit palace that they stopped for the night. Where once a grove of cedars might have grown, vigilantly tended by caring hands, now skulked barren husks. The long, dead trees stretched toward the sky like the bony fingers of a dying man, begging the gods to give them a merciful end to their facade of an existence. Seems as good a place as any to spend the night, said Povel, dismounting to prepare his horse's feed bag.
You are not the first to think so,
Sylvia said. Whatever do you mean? Sylvia nodded towards one of the desiccated trunks where sat a skeleton, mouth hanging open as if struck dead amid a fit of laughter. Weather-beaten rags clung to gnawed ribs, and a pair of surprisingly preserved boots covered the remains' feet. Gods, said Povel, a shudder traveling the course of his body. Should we find somewhere else to camp?
Does not matter to me,
said Sylvia.
The dead do not scare me.
Well, you've spent the better part of your life around the sick and dying. As for me...
We can find somewhere else to camp, Povel.
No, I'll be all right. I just won't look at it. Sylvia stifled a smile and dropped from the saddle.
Perhaps we should bury them.
Why? Is it Alexander?
It does not appear to be. No.
Then perhaps we should leave it be, Povel was quick to reply.
How one could make it so far as an alchemist with the fear of corpses as debilitating as yours is beyond me,
Sylvia quipped, this time letting her smile show through. Fear is a bit of a strong word. I prefer aversion. Sylvia approached the remains for a closer inspection of the bones. With a simple thought, she willed a ball of warm, yellow light into the palm of her hand to drive away the encroaching darkness. Aside from the teeth-scarred rib cage, there were no other obvious signs of violence left on the skeleton. Sylvia, will you leave it alone? Povel was exasperated. Help me pitch the tent so we can get some rest.
Give me a moment. I'd like to figure out how this fellow reached such a fate.
Why? Sylvia turned back and held Povel with a blank stare.
Because I would rather not end up in a similar fashion.
Povel rolled his eyes. I suppose you have a point. The clouds shrouded the moon and stars, allowing only the most meager amount of light to filter down onto Umbalathon. Though the soothing whistle of the wind could be heard outside, Sylvia was finding sleep elusive. Anxiety, diminutive but persistent, was digging its way to the forefront of her awareness.
I have been on edge all day. My nerves are overworked,
she told herself.
Best not to think about what tomorrow brings.
Can't sleep? Povel's voice asked in the darkness of the tent. Are you frightened?
A bit, perhaps. What about you?
A bit. Not nearly as much as I had expected. Povel was quiet for a moment before venturing another question. Are you not excited? You are closer to finding answers now more than ever.
I cannot count the number of times I've believed myself close to my goal,
said Sylvia, a hint of sorrow in her voice despite her best effort.
I learned to temper my hope long ago. But yes, I am eager to see what tomorrow's Delvians provide for us.
We will both find what we are seeking, Povel firmly stated. I'm sure of it. The morning sky was sundered by a savage rain that mercilessly pelted the canvas tent. It was like sitting inside of a drum, and Sylvia's ears ached by the time the downpour began to slacken. Despite the dreariness of the morning, Sylvia was eager to be off. There was knowledge to be found. I'm sure of what I prefer. The library's undoubtedly eerie atmosphere or the bone-chilling wetness of the outdoors, said Povel with a chuckle, his cloak drenched through before he could even saddle his horse.
I know what I prefer,
Sylvia replied, already saddled and goading her horse towards the road. In a hurry, are we? Povel asked, bemused.
Do you wish to linger in the rain?
I don't think a little haste will make a difference. We're already soaked. Sylvia could not explain the feeling that was creeping within her. There was an urge, almost like a tugging force, to reach the library as quickly as possible. Every moment spent motionless was like resting her feet too close to a fire.
I suppose I'm just a bit excited.
Apparently so. Well then, lead the way. They wound their way through the labyrinthian corpse of Umbalathon for the better part of the morning. The rain came down in steady sheets, never abandoning them until they neared the yawning entrance to the library. Sylvia paused and stared at the aperture glowing down upon her. It was dark within, so dark that the scant sunlight found itself swallowed up completely before it could reveal anything more than a stone threshold. "How tall?" Povel whispered. He craned his neck to try and find the tower's peak, but it was lost in the heavy clouds. "Incredible!" Sylvia dismounted, summoned a sphere of light to float above her head, and plunged into the blackness without hesitation. "Sylvia!" Povel cried, leaping from his horse. "Wait, we need to be careful!" The compulsion to move forward was almost unbearable, but Sylvia forced herself to slow her pace. Something was muddling her mind, pushing out all else but the desire for knowledge. "What has gotten into you?" asked Povel, taking her by the arm. "Are you trying to get yourself killed? Just look at the horses. They're practically frothing." Sylvia gently freed herself from Povel's grip.
I am fine, Povel. Come, let's see what we can find.
Povel stammered but only managed a frustrated grunt before lighting a torch and following after. To describe the monolith's interior as vast failed to capture the true enormity of the place. The vaulted ceiling rose farther than Sylvia's orb could illuminate, and their footfalls vanished into the void surrounding them without an echo to be heard. "Bones," Povel sounded calmer than Sylvia believed him to be, "and books." Indeed, the stone floor was littered with various bits of human remains and decaying, worm-eaten tomes. "I expected more books from a library," continued Povel, outstretching his arms. "I expected something. It's empty."
These books had to come from somewhere. Ah, see here.
Sylvia gestured towards a spiral staircase that wound its way upward and into the darkness.
This must be the way.
As they were just beginning to mount the stairs, Povel stopped short and emitted a sharp cry. "My head!" he groaned. "Gods, does that hurt!"
Are you all right?
Sylvia asked, staring down at Povel from halfway up the stairs. "I don't think so." Povel sank to his haunches and set down his torch to clutch his head with both hands. "I'm so dizzy."
Just wait there for it to pass.
"Sylvia, no, remember the headaches are connected to those stones they found in the skulls. You will go mad." Mustering every last thread of willpower, Sylvia stood firm. She could feel her fingernails digging into her palms while she fought to hold her ground.
Something has its grip on me. Talons far stronger than I are digging into my flesh and drawing me forward.
"Fight it!" growled Povel, grimacing fiercely from the pain. "Fight it!"
I'm sorry, Povel.
Sylvia meant every word, but she hadn't the strength to resist any longer. "Is it worth it? Is this knowledge worth the mere chance that it will bring Peter back?" Povel asked. Though his question was harsh, it was asked with nothing but concern. "You will end up just another pile of bones, lost to time." Sylvia left Povel and his protests behind and took the stairs two at a time. Guilt hung heavy on her shoulders, but she was unable to resist the urge any longer. Never before had she felt such an odd mixture of fear and elation. She could feel the proximity of the knowledge as a tingle on her skin. She was so close. Soon all the answers to any question she could ask would be within her grasp. She could uncover the truth behind Umbalathon, find the cure for any disease, and, if the gods willed it, discover how to reunite with her dearly departed pater. Reaching the top of the stairs, Sylvia found herself dwarfed by rows upon rows of behemoth bookshelves, each one heavily laden with books, scrolls, and strange scientific instruments. With her sphere tailing close behind, Sylvia rushed to the closest of the shelves and grabbed the first book she could lay hands on. An eruption of dust greeted her when she opened the text, but she paid the ancient motes no mind as she feverishly read the faded writing. Her eyes raced over the text, her brain just capable enough to register the information that was being forced inside of it. With all the casualness of one smashing an ant beneath their thumb, Sylvia pushed a cobweb-cloaked skeleton from the nearest chair and settled in. A small part of her was still aware that something was very wrong, but her mind was so engaged in reading that she was unable to muster the brain power to set the book down. She read and read as the hours passed by. She read until her eyes burned and her head felt as if it were swelling. When she finished one tome, she would leap to her feet and rush for another. Her fingers bled from the constant turning of pages. She was terrified. Her tears stained the age-worn pages and blurred her vision, driving her mad. Her hands, of an accord not her own, would wipe her eyes with such violence that she would see stars.
I cannot bear this much longer,
she thought, during one of the brief moments where she could tighten the feeble grasp she had on herself.
I hope I can find you in the afterlife, Peter.
By the time Sylvia was finishing her 7th book, a gnawing pain in her abdomen had risen to prominence in her awareness. Without taking her eyes off the pages, she felt around her pack for something, anything to assuage her hunger. Her fingers wrapped around a heel of crusted bread. With frenetic motion, she smashed the bread into her mouth and tore at it like a savage animal. In her famished fury, she bit deeply into one of her fingers, drawing blood and a warm, ferrous flavor.
I will not need all my fingers to turn these pages,
her addled conscience mused.
9 fingers is plenty.
Sylvia opened her mouth to continue her feast when she heard an odd scraping sound coming from the darkness between the bookshelves. From her periphery, she could just make out a twisted shape clawing its way along the floor toward her. She was uncertain as to what it was shambling about until a hand, bony and shriveled, planted itself within the pool of light provided by her orb. The sudden surge of terror cleared Sylvia's mind enough to become aware of the danger, but she was still unable to command her body to move. Yet the thrall of whatever power infested the library, Sylvia watched as the ghastly scholar inched closer and closer. The man was little more than skin and bone, his deep-set eyes glistening from within a leathery face. It was then that the true horror struck. She knew those eyes.
Alexander?
Run! The word fell from Alexander's dry mouth like a handful of sand. Run! Sylvia! Despite the warning, Alexander's hunger drove him forward. Sylvia wished with all her might that she could obey. She demanded her body to react, screamed and begged, but to no avail. She was forced to watch her demise draw near at an agonizing pace. It was then Alexander was but a hand's breadth away that a boot appeared from the shadows and crushed the poor explorer's skull with force enough to leave only dust. Sylvia heard someone calling her name, but the voice sounded distant, and she was unable to remove her gaze from Alexander's crumpled form. The last thing she recalled was a painful thump to the back of her head. Sylvia awoke to a landscape of dust and ash, and a sharp wind biting at her face. With effort, she sat up and took inventory of herself. Her entire body ached, and her thoughts came sluggish and murky. A tangle of new information swirled about her head. Some of it held potential use, but most of it was either too fragmented to make sense of or completely beyond her understanding. A burning sensation welled in the pit of her stomach upon the dreadful realization that none of this newfound knowledge drew her any nearer to reuniting with Peter. She wanted to cry, but found the endeavor too great. It was then that Sylvia noticed she was in motion, and by the rhythmic plodding, she guessed she was on a horse. She looked down and stared at the reins in bewilderment. Why couldn't she feel herself clutching the reins, and why were her hands so large? "How do you feel?" Povel asked from behind her. His voice was oddly level, as if he were struggling to hold back a shudder. Sylvia's heart launched itself into her throat from the start Povel gave her. She had not realized she was sharing a saddle with him.
Strange,
she answered with a modicum of composure.
but alive. How is your head?
Heavy. Different. Yours?
Quite sore. Am I correct in thinking it was you that cuffed me across the skull?
You are? Sorry about that. I was short of time and unable to come up with a better plan.
No apologies are necessary,
said Sylvia. Do you remember anything? Povel asked.
Unfortunately.
A small voice, a lingering remnant of whatever curse lay on Umbalathon, urged Sylvia to take one last look at the dead city, but she dared not, lest that hideous desire overwhelmed her once again. She stared ahead, letting the gray emptiness of the deadlands occupy her eyes. Wisps of ash danced past on the breeze, and Sylvia could have sworn that for the briefest of moments the wind-borne debris formed itself into the mocking image of Alexander's rictus skull. After what we've been through, I believe it's safe to say that Alexander is no longer with us, Povel said after a pause.
I think you are right,
Sylvia replied. She thought about informing Povel of the wretched scholar's identity, but decided to keep that knowledge to herself. It would do Povel no good knowing he had taken the life of a friend, regardless of how pitiful a life it had become.
How long was I enchanted?
Sylvia felt Povel shrug. I cannot say for certain, as I lost consciousness soon after you ascended the stairs. But night had fallen by the time I made it back to the horses. How long did it feel like?
A lifetime, and then some.
Gods, what a worthless venture this has been. Sylvia sat up straighter in the saddle. Now that she had had some time to rein in her frantic thoughts, she found that her memories of her compulsive studies were becoming sharper.
Do not be so quick to despair. I did a great deal of reading during my time at the library.
You remember all you read? Povel asked, incredulous.
Bits and pieces, Sylvia answered. Enough to put something together, I think.
So there's an afterlife then?
Other lives at least. It is a start.
Will you be able to find Peter in one of those other lives? Asked Povel.
There is a chance.
Good. I would have hated to leave that city empty-handed, said Povel, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Sylvia rested her head against Povel's chest, a sudden weariness overtaking her.
Of course, I will need time to formulate all this knowledge into something comprehensible.
That is just as well, said Povel with a sigh, because I don't think I have it in me to go on another journey with you for quite some time. Sylvia laughed.
We will see about that,